Welcome to Dweller of the Dark. We are a channel honoring the yellowed and blackened bones of many prominent authors. We will be digging up several obscure, strange, and forgotten authors who influenced many of the great horror, science fiction, and fantasy writers today. More tales of the horrifying, obscure, strange, and forgotten are climbing out of the tombs. Subscribe, comment, like, donate, or I'll send the devil of black by you to rip your head off, as we did the like button. Unknown horror masters, send us ghoulish delights for the Skull and Bones collection. Your pound of writer's flesh will feed our ghouls for now. Books, albums, websites in the links below. Children of Horror, Legion of Ghouls. The season of Halloween has arrived. Each night, we will present a tale, song, or poem in the ghoulish spirit of the season. For day 30, we present Henry Kuttner's It Walks by Night and The Graveyard Rats. It walks by night. Johann leaned heavily against a tall obelisk of discolored marble, his fever-weakened body trembling with exhaustion. The graveyard was a dim black sea, with pale slabs and monoliths standing in irregular ranks all about him. He fumbled with the slide of his lantern, and a white beam sprang out vividly, etching the man's gaunt figure in sharp detail. Deep shadows lay in the hollows of his cheeks and beneath his dilated, smoldering eyes. His face had an angry flush which betrayed the fever blazing in his brain, fever that had burned away lifelong barriers of fear and driven him to this ancient burying ground where few would have ventured after sundown. For, as all men knew, a horror dwelt among these tombs, an ancient horror that had come down through the generations. There were tales of a thing that walked by night among the graves, so that sometimes when men came searching in broad daylight, they found new graves opened, coffins ruthlessly torn apart, and the bodies gone. Occasionally, one of the villagers would bury his kin in the cemetery at Christian, 20 miles to the north. But this was seldom done, since the horror had dwelt in the graveyard longer than the oldest gray beard, and a kind of hopeless apathy hung like a somber pall over the village. Moreover, there was a tale that, long ago, in the year of the Great Plague, when all bodies were burned for fear of spreading the pestilence, something had come forth from among the tombs and had burst nightly into the houses on the outskirts of the village. A dozen people had vanished without a trace, and at last, in desperation, the plague-infected corpses had been interred in the old burying ground. Thereafter, the village slept in peace, although now and then a lone traveler or itinerant peddler would disappear, never to be seen again. Still, as the older men whispered among themselves, it was lucky that worse things did not befall. But now, Johann was driven by a fierce urge that made him disregard the ancient menace that lurked among the tombs. He had come for his wife, Elsa. His bride for scarcely a year had been buried while Johann lay delirious, raving with the same fever that had proved fatal to his wife. Believing him asleep, his cousin's wife had talked too freely, and Johann had learned that Elsa had been interred in the devil-haunted graveyard beyond the outskirts of the village. His beloved Elsa, daughter of the ancient Aubert clan that could trace their fathers back through Thurn and Taxus, the prey of the ghoul. Horror had lent Johann strength to leave his bed and slip unnoticed from his cousin's house, pausing only to snatch his pistol and a lantern. Now he drew the weapon from his shirt as footsteps sounded suddenly nearby. A man came into view in the starlight, gingerly picking his way among the graves. As Johann recognized Carl, his cousin, he thrust the pistol back into his shirt and let the light from his lantern flare out. The newcomer gave a startled cry, quickly muffled. Carl stepped into the wan splotch of light, relief plain in his pale face. "Johann," I thought, "what are you doing here? You can't help Elsa now." Johann looked away abruptly, his mouth working. Carl put a hand on his cousin's shoulder, but Johann shook it off impatiently. "It's your fault, Carl," he accused, his eyes dark with anger. "You let them bury Elsa here, in this devil-ridden place." Carl made a placating gesture. "What could I do? I told them you would not." "I know." The resentment was gone from Johann's voice. It was very bitter now. "Our heads have been bowed beneath the yoke for a long time. Too long, Carl. Elsa shall not. She has been buried a week now. You have no shovel." It was true. Johann had no time to procure one during his flight. He said slowly, "I can guard her grave. At any rate, you can go back to the village and get shovels." Carl was silent. After a moment, Johann laughed mirthlessly. "Bring the shovels tomorrow then," he jeered. "You won't be afraid to come here in daylight." Stung, Carl responded, "It's not daylight now. Come home, Johann. We can get Elsa tomorrow. One more night won't. It's dangerous, Johann. They say it's been walking again." Johann shrugged with a nonchalance he did not feel. He was shivering in the chill wind that blew over the neglected graves. His fears, forgotten in his delirium, were slowly creeping back to torment him, but he pushed them resolutely aside. "I'm not afraid," he growled, and moved forward among the graves, his lantern sending out a beam of yellow light that rested on lichen-stained stone and the worm-eaten and weathered surface of wooden slabs and crosses. Once he tripped over a fallen tombstone, half buried in the ground, and would have fallen had not Carl caught him. Carl began a frantic protest, which his cousin did not hear. Johann was staring intently into the gloom. He took a few hasty steps, and at his feet loomed the black gulf of an open grave. He sent the beam of the lantern darting down into it and saw that the coffin lid was broken and shattered, and that the sarcophagus itself was empty. Even before the light searched the inscription upon the wooden slab at the head of the violated grave, he knew what would be painted there. Beside him, Carl caught his breath in a gasp of fear, but Johann merely stood silent, swaying a little, the dank wind blowing coldly across his wet face, and his thoughts were a chaotic swirl in which horror and grief and anger were mingled. Out of his poignant grief and his horror, fierce anger racked his feverish brain with surges of red rage that shook him with their intensity. Under his shirt, he felt the bulk of the pistol, and he gripped it fiercely. Elsa! Her slim white body, the prey of the ghoul! Suddenly, all Johann's fear was forgotten in his blinding, overwhelming anger. Carl was tugging at his arm. He turned to meet his cousin's frightened gaze. Johann, what are you waiting for? We can't stay here. It has walked again. No, Johann barked out the word fiercely, his eyes blazing. Elsa! It's too late, Johann. Elsa is gone. Is it too late for vengeance? Johann asked quietly, and at his words, Carl shrank back, stark amazement in his face. Vengeance? He whispered the word fearfully, and a shudder racked him. He shot an apprehensive glance into the dimness about them. Then he said, still whispering, You are mad, Johann. Deliberately, Johann drew out his pistol. Very well, I am mad. But, Carl, if it were your wife, he broke off, his lips twitching, and when he resumed, his voice was chill with inflexible purpose. Listen to me, Carl. I'm going to make someone, God, man, or devil, suffer for this crime. He glanced at the black gulf of the violated grave. So go home, Carl. You can't help me now. Carl opened his mouth, but the words died in his throat. His eyes flashed past Johann's shoulder, and into them sprang a look of panicked fear. With a strangled scream, he spun about and went racing off, his footsteps disquietingly loud in the chill, empty silence. Johann turned quickly. At first, he saw nothing in the dim starlight. Then, far away, he saw a faint movement among the tombs. There was a flicker of motion in the distance, where an ancient mausoleum stood all alone on the side of a little hillock. He waited, scarcely breathing, for a time, but there was no further movement at the distant tomb. Carl's footsteps had died away, and there was not a sound to be heard. Johann fingered the pistol irresolutely. Then he thrust it back in his shirt and hurriedly made his way among the graves to where the mausoleum stood on the knoll, pale and ominous in the starlight. The tomb was incredibly ancient and weathered, overgrown with a thick coating of lichen that draped it like gray spiderwebs. There was an inscription above the door, but save for the single word, Maranatha, it was illegible. Johann did not pause to examine it after he saw that the grate stone portal was open. With cold rage surging within him, he stepped over the threshold and sent the light darting about the tomb. It was empty, bare. Granite walls met his gaze, but there was a door of rusted metal set in the further wall, and this was ajar. Johann squeezed through the gap and held the lantern high. He was in an empty passage, paved with great stone slabs sloping down into the side of the little hill. A faint whispering sound, like the slithering of water over jagged rocks, was audible, and Johann cautiously advanced. The passage turned and twisted in the rock, but it continued to descend steeply, and twice Johann passed the black mouths of side tunnels. Now the faint whispering was louder. He recognized the sound of voices, but there was a curious squeaking and snarling that puzzled him, a sound such as might originate in a nest of rats. The cold tide of sanity was slowly rising in Johann's brain, and misgivings were beginning to assail him. But the thought of Elsa's looted grave enabled him to force them out of his mind. He replaced the slide on the lantern and moved forward in utter darkness, feeling his way and straining to distinguish an intelligible word from the babble of chatterings and whisperings that he heard. Slowly he advanced, sliding his hand along the wall, and suddenly a voice sounded distinct and clear above the sly mutterings. It was harsh and grating, possessing a curious quality of depth, as though it came from far underground, and it said distinctly, "Has been going long." A wave of fear came rushing up to overwhelm Johann, and he clung desperately to the thought of Elsa and his vengeance. Fighting back his horror, he edged forward, and as though at a signal, a sudden silence fell. Johann caught a whisper. "We'll be back to bring us food." Behind him, there was a rustling, swiftly growing louder. In the blackness, nothing was visible, but Johann flung himself flat against the wall. The rustling swept past him, and for a moment, an overpowering stench filled his nostrils. He was conscious that something had passed close to him, something he could not see for the darkness. Although he felt sick and giddy with its passing, he leaned against the wall, grateful for its support, and the whisperings and shrillings broke out afresh, this time with an eerie note of disappointment. A new voice spoke, a quiet, emotionless voice with a dreadful feline purr in it. "No food could I find, my ancestors. No food or drink. Must we go hungry?" Another voice whined, and a plaintive series of cries burst from the grim darkness that pulsed with unseen, horrific life. "You must feed us. It is your duty. We are unable." A deeper voice spoke. "You must fulfill your trust. Each of us fed our ancestors who could not feed themselves, and it is your duty to find us food. When in time you, too, become like us,
unable to go forth to search of the new graves, you will expect the next heir to fulfill his duty. I found food for you 2 nights ago.
The other voice purred, and Johann caught his breath and shuddered in the shielding darkness.
It is your trust and your privilege.
The deep voice cut in, brittle and harsh.
This is the curse and the blessing of our blood that knows no other life after death.
But there are so many, cried the other, and a stifled gasp of fear came from Johann's stiff lips. A taut silence fell, and the man turned to ice. Past him went a soft rustling, almost brushing his numb body, swiftly dying away. Then there was no sound, only the charnel darkness that pressed silently upon him, and behind him he heard a heavy thud. Stung into life, Johann spun about and, in an agony of fear, went racing back through the twisted corridor, back to the open air and the clean starlight. He felt a heavy blow on his chest and staggered back, almost falling, the lantern slipping from his grasp and thudding to the ground. As he tottered there in the blackness, he heard the abominable rustling go past him again and fade into silence. Gasping, uttering little moans, he fell on his hands and knees and groped frantically for the lantern. For a moment, it eluded his clutching fingers, and Johann felt the skin of his back crawling with the expectation of an attack. Then with a sob of relief, he found the lantern and snatched off the slide, praying that it had not gone out. It had not. A yellow beam of light pitilessly illuminated the thing that had halted Johann's flight. The great door in the tomb. The door by which he had entered this Cimmerian cave of night and horror. But now it was no longer ajar. He realized what had happened. The rustling that had passed him. The heavy thud. The creature, Johann dared not give it a name, had slipped past him and closed the door to prevent his escape. Breathing heavily, Johann put down the lantern and examined the door. There were no handles or knobs. It was a bare, rivet-studded plate of rusty metal. He braced his shoulder against it and strained until his head swam, but he could not move the door. Again, swift anger mounted within him, and the thought of Elsa supplied the spark to the tinderbox of his fury. With rage and fear battling within him, he drew out his pistol, examined it to see if the moisture of the vault had damped the charge, and slowly began to retrace his steps. He paused occasionally to flash the light behind him, but nothing lurked at his heels. Nothing but the black tunnel mouths that seemed to watch him ominously. And presently he saw that he was on the threshold of an archway that led into silent, unstirring darkness. Twice Johann went forward, and twice he retreated in fear. At last he raised the pistol and stepped over the threshold, swiftly flashing the light about the great vault in which he stood. For a moment he thought he was confronting an array of mummies, withered and dry. They were lying against the walls in grotesque postures, a dozen brown, wrinkled bodies, some of them merely skeletons with wrinkled, dark skin stretched over their bones. The floor was buried beneath a carpet of bones, ranging in color from crumbled black to shining white bones, on which the marks of gnawing were dreadfully evident. At Johann's feet, a skull grinned up at him in a grim mockery of mirth. As the light gleamed through the tomb, a frightful rustling and a stir went over the withered bodies. There was a monstrous shifting and squirming, and Johann saw moving what should never move, what should always lie silent and still and dead under the coffin lid. The things crawled about like maggots, blindly creeping away from the light. And Johann still stood there, the lantern in one hand and his pistol in the other, without moving a muscle or turning his eyes from the charnel horror before him. The light gleamed on, cold, shiny eyes staring at him speculatively. Behind him came the rustling, and Johann swung about, his light stabbing out through the blackness. Far down the passage, a vague figure was moving toward him, slowly, implacably. Behind him came an outburst of abominable squeakings and whistlings. Johann jerked up his pistol, the thought of Elsa steadying his hand. He would wait until the thing was almost upon him, and then... But his fear betrayed him. The crash of the explosion sent sharp echoes rolling through the vault. The dreadful form did not pause. It glided onward, silently save for the faint rustling of garments. And Johann took a step back. Something clutched at his ankle, and in a frenzy of fear, he kicked free. For a second, he had turned his back on the half-seen figure that was inexorably drawing nearer, and when he swung about, it was almost upon him. There was no time to reload the pistol. Johann flung up his arm as though the lantern had been a weapon. Two things happened almost simultaneously. A purring, gloating voice came from the dim form, and it said triumphantly,
"We shall not go hungry."
And the light revealed the face of the approaching horror, and Johann dropped the lantern and began to scream over and over.
"Elsa! Elsa!"
Graveyard Rats by Henry Kuttner. Old Masson, the caretaker of one of Salem's oldest and most neglected cemeteries, had a feud with the rats. Generations ago, they had come up from the wharves and settled in the graveyard, a colony of abnormally large rats. And when Masson had taken charge after the inexplicable disappearance of the former caretaker, he decided that they must go. At first, he set traps for them and put poisoned food by their burrows. And later he tried to shoot them, but it did no good. The rats stayed, multiplying and overrunning the graveyard with their ravenous hordes. They were large, even for the mus decumanus, which sometimes measures 15 inches in length, exclusive of the naked, pink and gray tail. Masson had caught glimpses of some as large as good-sized cats. And when once or twice the gravediggers had uncovered their burrows, the malodorous tunnels were large enough to enable a man to crawl into them on his hands and knees. The ships that had come generations ago from distant ports to the rotting Salem wharves had brought strange cargoes. Masson wondered sometimes at the extraordinary size of these burrows. He recalled certain vaguely disturbing legends he had heard since coming to ancient, witch-haunted Salem, tales of moribund, inhuman life that was said to exist in forgotten burrows in the earth. The old days when Cotton Mather had hunted down the evil cults that worshipped Hecate and the dark Magna Mater, and frightful orgies had passed. But dark gabled houses still lean perilously towards each other over narrow cobbled streets, and blasphemous secrets and mysteries were said to be hidden in subterranean cellars and caverns where forgotten pagan rites were still celebrated in defiance of law and sanity. Wagging their gray heads wisely, the elders declared that there were worse things than rats and maggots crawling in the unhallowed earth of the ancient Salem cemeteries. And then, too, there was this curious dread of the rats. Masson disliked and respected the ferocious little rodents, for he knew the danger that lurked in their flashing, needle-sharp fangs. But he could not understand the inexplicable horror which the oldsters held for deserted, rat-infested houses. He had heard vague rumors of ghoulish beings that dwelt far underground and that had the power of commanding the rats, marshaling them like horrible armies. The rats, the old men whispered, were messengers between this world and the grim and ancient caverns far below Salem. Bodies had been stolen from graves for nocturnal subterranean feasts, they said. The myth of the Pied Piper is a fable that hides a blasphemous horror, and the black pits of Avernus have brought forth hell-spawn monstrosities that never venture into the light of day. Masson paid little attention to these tales. He did not fraternize with his neighbors and, in fact, did all he could to hide the existence of the rats from intruders. Investigation, he realized, would undoubtedly mean the opening of many graves, and while some of the gnawed, empty coffins could be attributed to the activities of the rats, Masson might find it difficult to explain the mutilated bodies that lay in some of the coffins. The purest gold is used in filling teeth, and this gold is not removed when a man is buried. Clothing, of course, is another matter, where usually the undertaker provides a plain, broadcloth suit that is cheap and easily recognizable. But gold is another matter, and sometimes, too, there were medical students and less reputable doctors who were in need of cadavers and not over-scrupulous as to where these were obtained. So far, Masson had successfully managed to discourage investigation. He had fiercely denied the existence of the rats, even though they sometimes robbed him of his prey. Masson did not care what happened to the bodies after he had performed his gruesome thefts, but the rats inevitably dragged away the whole cadaver through the hole they gnawed in the coffin. The size of these burrows occasionally worried Masson. Then, too, there was the curious circumstance of the coffins always being gnawed open at the end, never at the side or top. It was almost as though the rats were working under the direction of some impossibly intelligent leader. Now he stood in an open grave and threw a last sprinkling of wet earth on the heap beside the pit. It was raining, a slow, cold drizzle that for weeks had been descending from soggy black clouds. The graveyard was a slough of yellow, sucking mud from which the rain-washed tombstones stood up in irregular battalions. The rats had retreated to their burrows, and Masson had not seen one for days. But his gaunt, unshaved face was set in frowning lines. The coffin on which he was standing was a wooden one. The body had been buried several days earlier, but Masson had not dared to disinter it before. A relative of the dead man had been coming to the grave at intervals, even in the drenching rain. But he would hardly come at this late hour, no matter how much grief he might be suffering. Masson thought, grinning wryly. He straightened and laid the shovel aside. From the hill on which the ancient graveyard lay, he could see the lights of Salem flickering dimly through the downpour. He drew a flashlight from his pocket. He would need light now. Taking up the spade, he bent and examined the fastenings of the coffin. Abruptly, he stiffened. Beneath his feet, he sensed an unquiet stirring and scratching, as though something were moving within the coffin. For a moment, a pang of superstitious fear shot through Masson, and then rage replaced it as he realized the significance of the sound. The rats had forestalled him again. In a paroxysm of anger, Masson wrenched at the fastenings of the coffin. He got the sharp edge of the shovel underneath the lid and pried it up until he could finish the job with his hands. Then he set the flashlight's cold beam darting down into the coffin. Rain spattered against the white satin lining. The coffin was empty. Masson saw a flicker of movement at the head of the case and darted the light in that direction. The end of the sarcophagus had been gnawed through, and a gaping hole led into darkness. A black shoe, limp and dragging, was disappearing as Masson watched, and abruptly he realized that the rats had forestalled him by only a few minutes. He fell on his hands and knees and made a hasty clutch at the shoe, and the flashlight incontinently fell into the coffin and went out. The shoe was tugged from his grasp. He heard a sharp, excited squealing, and then he had the flashlight again and was darting its light into the burrow. It was a large one. It had to be, or the corpse could not have been dragged along it. Masson wondered at the size of the rats that could carry away a man's body. But the thought of the loaded revolver in his pocket fortified him. Probably if this corpse had been an ordinary one, Masson would have left the rats with their spoils rather than venture into the narrow burrow. But he remembered an especially fine set of cufflinks he had observed, as well as a stick pin that was undoubtedly a genuine pearl. Scarcely a pause, he clipped the flashlight to his belt and crept into the burrow. It was a tight fit, but he managed to squeeze himself along. Ahead of him, in the flashlight's glow, he could see the shoes dragging along the wet earth of the bottom of the tunnel. He crept along the burrows as rapidly as he could, occasionally barely able to squeeze his lean body through the narrow walls. The air was overpowering with its musty stench of carrion. If he could not reach the corpse in a minute, Masson decided he would turn back. Elated fears were beginning to crawl, agate-like, within his mind, but greed urged him on. He crawled forward, several times passing the miles of adjoining tunnels. The walls of the burrow were damp and slimy, and twice, lumps of dirt dropped behind him. The second time, he paused and screwed his head around to look back. He could see nothing, of course, until he had unhooked the flashlight from his belt and reversed it. Several clods lay on the ground behind him, and the danger of his position suddenly became real and terrifying. With thoughts of a cave-in making his pulse race, he decided to abandon the pursuit, even though he had almost overtaken the corpse and the invisible things that pulled it. But he had overlooked one thing. The burrow was too narrow to allow him to turn. Panic touched him briefly, but he remembered a side tunnel he had just passed and backed awkwardly along the tunnel until he came to it. He thrust his legs into it, backing, until he found himself able to turn. Then he hurriedly began to retrace his way, although his knees were bruised and painful. Agonizing pain shot through his leg. He felt sharp teeth sink into his flesh and kicked out frantically. There was a shrill squealing and the scurry of many feet. Flashing the light behind him, Masson caught his breath in a sob of fear as he saw a dozen great rats watching him intently, their slitted eyes glittering in the light. They were great, misshapen things, as large as cats, and behind them he caught a glimpse of a dark shape that stirred and moved swiftly aside into the shadow. And he shuddered at the unbelievable size of the thing. The light had held them for a moment, but they were edging closer, their teeth dull orange in the pale light. Masson tugged at his pistol, managed to extricate it from his pocket and aimed carefully. It was an awkward position, and he tried to press his feet into the soggy sides of the burrows so that he should not inadvertently send a bullet into one of them. The rolling thunder of the shot deafened him for a time, and the clouds of smoke set him coughing. When he could hear again and the smoke had cleared, he saw the rats were gone. He put the pistol back and began to creep swiftly along the tunnel. And then, with a scurry and a rush, they were upon him again. They swarmed over his legs, biting and squealing insanely. And Masson shrieked horribly as he snatched for his gun. He fired without aiming, and only luck saved him from blowing a foot off. This time the rats did not retreat so far, but Masson was crawling as swiftly as he could along the burrow, ready to fire again at the first sound of another attack. There was a patter of feet, and he sent the light stabbing behind him. A great gray rat paused and watched him. Its long, ragged whiskers twitched, and its scabrous, naked tail was moving slowly from side to side. Masson shouted, and the rat retreated. He crawled on, pausing briefly. The black gap of a side tunnel at his elbow, as he made out a shapeless huddle on the damp clay a few yards ahead. For a second, he thought it was a mass of earth that had been dislodged from the roof. And then he recognized it as a human body. It was a brown and shriveled mummy. And with a dreadful, unbelieving shock, Masson realized that it was moving. It was crawling towards him, and in the pale glow of the flashlight, the man saw a frightful, gargoyle face thrust into his own. It was the passionless, death's head skull of a long-dead corpse, instinct with hellish life, and the glazed eyes, swollen and bulbous, betrayed the thing's blindness. It made a faint groaning sound as it crawled towards Masson, stretched its ragged and granulated lips in a grin of dreadful hunger, and Masson was frozen with abysmal fear and loathing. Just before the horror touched him, Masson flung himself frantically into the burrow at his side. He heard a scrambling noise at his heels, and the thing groaned dully as it came after him. Masson, glancing over his shoulder, screamed and propelled himself desperately through the narrow burrow. He crawled along awkwardly, sharp stones cutting his hands and knees. Dirt showered into his eyes, but he dared not pause even for a moment. He scrambled on, gasping, cursing, and praying hysterically. Squealing triumphantly, the rats came at him, horrible hunger in their eyes. Masson almost succumbed to their vicious teeth before he succeeded in beating them off. The passage was narrowing, and in a frenzy of terror, he kicked and screamed and fired until the hammer clicked on an empty shell. But he had driven them off. He found himself crawling under a great stone embedded in the roof that dug cruelly into his back. It moved a little as his weight struck it, and an idea flashed into Masson's fright-crazed mind. If he could bring down the stone so that it blocked the tunnel. The earth was wet and soggy from the rains, and he hunched himself half upright and dug away at the dirt around the stone. The rats were coming closer. He saw their eyes glowing in the reflection of the flashlight's beam. Still he clawed frantically at the earth. The stone was giving. He tugged at it, and it rocked in its foundation. A rat was approaching, the monster he had already glimpsed. Gray and leprous and hideous, it crept forward with its orange teeth bared, and in its wake came the blind dead thing, groaning as it crawled. Masson gave a last frantic tug at the stone. He felt it slide downwards, and then he went scrambling along the tunnel. Behind him, the stone crashed down, and he heard a sudden, frightful shriek of agony. Clods showered upon his legs. A heavy weight fell on his feet, and he dragged them free with difficulty. The entire tunnel was collapsing. Gasping with fear, Masson threw himself forward as the soggy earth collapsed at his heels. The tunnel narrowed until he could barely use his hands and legs to propel himself. He wriggled forward like an eel, suddenly felt satin tearing beneath his clawing fingers, and then his head crashed against something that barred his path. He moved his legs, discovering that they were not pinned under the collapsed earth. He was lying flat on his stomach, and when he tried to raise himself, he found that the roof was only a few inches from his back. Panic shot through him. When the blind horror had blocked his path, he had flung himself desperately into a side tunnel, a tunnel that had no outlet. He was in a coffin, an empty coffin, into which he had crept through the hole the rats had gnawed in its end. He tried to turn on his back and found that he could not. The lid of the coffin pinned him down inexorably. Then he braced himself and strained at the coffin lid. It was immovable. And even if he could escape from the sarcophagus, how could he claw his way up through 5 feet of hard-packed earth? He found himself gasping. It was dreadfully fetid, unbearably hot. In a paroxysm of terror, he ripped and clawed at the satin until it was shredded. He made a futile attempt to dig with his feet at the earth from the collapsed burrow that blocked his retreat. If he were only able to reverse his position, he might be able to claw his way through to air. White-hot agony lanced through his breast, throbbed in his eyeballs. His head seemed to be swelling, growing larger and larger. And suddenly, he heard the exultant squealing of the rats. He began to scream insanely, but could not drown them out. For a moment, he thrashed about hysterically within his narrow prison, and then he was quiet, gasping for air. His eyelids closed, his blackened tongue protruded, and he sank down into the blackness of death with the mad squealing of the rats dinning in his ears. Thank you for listening. Have a good night.